I'm very grateful to have been asked to be here today. This is not a sermon. I would love to preach a sermon sometime, but I don't know how to do that very well. I'm much better at having conversations on the podcast, and I've also been presenting this research for a few churches around spiritual harm and abuse. So that's what we're talking about today. And I'm going to try and keep myself to under 30 minutes to provide plenty of time for any questions, but maybe even more importantly, the chance for you guys to break out and process this together, because I have a feeling that many of you will hear things today that remind you of experiences that you've had. So I'm going to share my screen here, and I'm going to unfortunately have my notes over to the side, so I'll be a little bit less I'll be looking at you a little less than I'd like to otherwise, but oh no, here we go. I found a way to do it. Okay, so what we're talking about today is spiritual harm and abuse. A little table of contents. There's not a ton of happy stuff in here today. This is not primarily going to be an inspirational presentation. This is a conversation about the darker underbelly of living life in a religious community. And so we're going to start off with some definitions, and then we're going to talk about basically the two main types that are uncovered by my own research and other people's research: external events, things that happen to us, and internal states that result from those events. But I do want to say that if you are an abuse survivor, you should know that many types of abuse and trauma are going to come up this morning in this conversation. So let's start off with some definitions, as well as talking about the value of religious life and Christianity as well. So here's how I'm defining spiritual abuse. It's a form of emotional and psychological abuse perpetrated by a religious leader or group, and or with a religious or spiritual component, usually involving coercion or control. That is kind of a word salad, and also not very, also somehow not specific and specific at the same time. We're going to make better sense of it as we go along. But the main thing is to understand that spiritual abuse can be in addition to other abuse. So you could be sexually abused by a stranger, or you could be sexually abused by a priest. And if you're sexually abused by a priest, then you are also spiritually abused. Does that make sense? And the reason I throw harm in there and I say spiritual harm and abuse is that we want to be careful about too much concept creep, where, you know, if everything is traumatic, then nothing is traumatic, that kind of a thing. And not everything is abusive, and not everything is even harmful. Some things are just harmful and they don't rise to the level of abuse. Some of that is in the eye of the beholder, the victim or survivor. But that's just, I just tried to, you know, get it, show that there's a continuum, right? It's not, something can be, oh, it's a little harmful. Oh, it's pretty harmful. Oh, it's certainly abusive. And it could fall anywhere on that continuum, whether or not someone means to be abusive. But the first part of this discussion that's really important here is, you know, with a church audience, I don't need to motivate very well why it matters to talk about spiritual abuse. If you're a member of a church, you know already in your bones, in your life experience, that being a member of a church is a good thing for you. But when I'm talking to more like research or less religious audiences, I like to make this clear because I think it's important, and it's fun for us religious people to know that the academic research is quite clear on this. These are not necessarily religious or Christian researchers, people all across the religious spectrum, and they continually find that religion and church, both Christianity and other faiths, are good for us. We sleep better. We have lower suicide rates. We have inherent protection against disease, and we live longer. Moving to mental health, we have more resilience. We have more reported happiness and lower reports of depression. We have higher self-esteem. We have higher reported life satisfaction. Pro-social behavior, this is stuff like stuff that's good for society, good for our neighbors. Acts of mercy and compassion toward the poor, sick, and marginalized are reported more often among the religious than the non-religious. We have increased social support, and religious activity includes sanctions against risky behavior, risky sex, deviant peer groups in adolescence, substance abuse in both adults and adolescents. By the way, I use the word religious here. A lot of Christians have a sense of, well, I'm not religious. I have a relationship with Jesus. I'm not using it in that sense. I'm using it in the broadest sense, like if I were doing a TED talk, you know, everything that you would think of and that an average person would think of as religious. Protestantism, Catholicism, Buddhism, Islam. That's what I mean by religious. So I'm not saying, I'm not using that sort of in-group language within evangelicalism of religion versus relationship or something like that. And then for our purposes here, the big benefit is that religion is helpful for healing from abuse. So we see lower PTSD symptoms after family abuse. Adult survivors of child abuse have reduced depression, more self-acceptance, more hope, and more resolution of the abuse if they are religiously involved. Coping through religious channels often sets a pathway from either growth or decline from traumatic experiences. So people are more likely to grow rather than decline after traumas. And that last one is particularly important because this, for me, is the most pernicious aspect of spiritual abuse. Religion is a primary form of healing from abuse. So spiritual abuse can cut off access to precisely the healing that it requires. It is as if you went to the hospital to get your broken bone set and the surgeon messed up and gave you a hemorrhage while you're there. And then you don't want to go to hospitals anymore because you associate it with bad surgeons who threaten your life. Right? We need the hospital to be a place that we feel safe, that we can trust what a doctor is going to do. If we don't trust hospitals, there are a lot of things we're not going to be able to heal from. And I like to use an image of religion as nuclear fission. So two uses of nuclear fission that we're all familiar with: nuclear energy, power plants. When a nuclear power plant is operating well, most of you probably know, it produces the safest, the sort of the best for the earth and cheapest electricity you can get. It is like this unending possibility. It's powerful and it's clean and green. Occasionally, nuclear reactors fail. And this is more like the other use of nuclear fission, which was used to create the first atomic bombs. And so nuclear fission is this insanely powerful thing that we've discovered how it works. And it can be used to create almost limitless energy with no cost, little cost to the environment, or it can destroy tens of thousands of lives in an instant. This is how I think about the role of religion and spirituality in our lives. It is central. It is connected deeply to everything in us. So that's setting the stage. As I said, there are two major categories here. The first is these external events. So these are potentially abusive external events, things that happen to us, things we might be taught, etc. So there are other studies of spiritual abuse. I did a big survey project with 3,200 respondents and I'm in the middle of trying to get my spiritual abuse scale published in a journal. I'm about to submit it. And so there are other categories we might find, but here are the ones that I found in my research by doing a big review of all the literature, and then throwing in a survey, and then seeing what clumped together. So the first one is authoritarian. I'm going to go through each of these 5. I'm going to give maybe a couple examples, and then I'm going to read one quote from each of these categories from what's called the qualitative literature. So this is peer-reviewed research that is interview-based. So these are interviews with survivors. So this first one I call authoritarian leadership. For instance, you might have been expected to consult a pastor for non-religious decisions, who has like a lot of control in various aspects of your life. Your pastor may explicitly claim to speak for God. Some people report being asked to give up vocational goals or educational goals to engage in ministry acts for their church by their pastor. You may have experienced extreme pressure to become a pastor or a missionary because of the culture of a community. Here is a quote from someone who experienced this authoritarian leadership. I challenged him after he made a statement, and I said, "Are you saying to us here that when you speak the infallible word from God?" He looked at me and said, "Yes, I am speaking an infallible word from God." Now, there's something maybe worth saying here. Someone quoting the Bible and saying this is the infallible word of God may be appropriate in certain contexts if they're literally just meaning the verse that they are quoting. But often, as I'm sure many of us have experienced, there is some interpretation going on. And they're not merely quoting the scripture. They are giving you an interpretation of the scripture that is specific to their church, them as a leader, perhaps their denomination, the way they were taught to interpret it in seminary, or taught by someone else. And when we get to interpretation, no matter what we think of the Bible, we're no longer dealing with an infallible word from God, because now humans are involved. We're interpreting. We might get it right. We might get it wrong. That's more what I'm getting at. I'm not arguing against the inspiration of Scripture, to be clear.
Okay, that's actually good.
The second category that came up is what I call violence, horror, and punishment. So examples of this would include, vivid descriptions of the end of the world or hell, Satan and demons presented to children too young. This includes seeing scripture used to justify violence or justify abusive child-parent relationships, or terror and horror being used to motivate religious decisions. For instance, there's this quote. This is an apocalyptic focused Christian group here. If I didn't live God's way, then my children would pay the price and they would die an early death. It engulfed me. They kept on saying, the end is so close that your children's lives are at risk. I chose that I had to give my energy to that rather than to finish my studies and follow my career in architecture. So here we can see an example of a parent who had a career goal that they were already pursuing. And this group was so confident in their belief that everything was ending soon that this person gave up their life goals. And as you'll note, this happened in 2011. That was 10 years ago. I mean, the article came out in 2011. The story might be from 1992 for all I know. And of course, that group was wrong. The end did not come. And what were the consequences of that teaching? So this third one is discrimination. This can be gender discrimination, racial, sexual orientation, indigenous discrimination. There's not a ton to be said here. I think you guys probably get the idea There will be a little bit of eye of the beholder around gender and sexual orientation discrimination. Some people will hold to theological beliefs that they feel require them to treat women or non-straight people a certain way. But even if so, even if we can disagree on that doctrinally, you can end up discriminating against someone even in a way that you don't intend to, even if you hold to those beliefs. So here's a quote from a woman who wanted to be more involved in her church. The church always talks about finding your gift and using it. I know my giftings, and I'm not allowed to use any of them in the church. My top gifting is always teaching, and I'm not allowed to use that in the church because I'm a woman, unless I want to teach little babies, which I don't. I would assume most of us have probably been involved in a church, maybe not, it's California, who knows, but involved in a church where women's roles were severely limited. Again, that is based on an interpretation of scripture that not all churches agree on. Medical care. This one is interesting. Most of us have not experienced the most extreme forms of this, which would be something like, Jehovah's Witnesses refusing blood transfusions, or Christian Scientists not going to the doctor at all and just praying. That would be on the extreme end of this continuum. But there's something in the middle that I bet a lot more of us will relate to. And this is about being deterred from seeking mental health care. This is a longer quote, but I think it's so powerful. The youth pastor also called my parents in and sat them down and told them that they were going to hell, that they were raising me wrong, and that I was possessed by demons, and that I was possessed by the devil if I was diagnosed with depression, that depression was a choice, and it was actually really someone just letting the devil inside of them. He asked their permission to speak with me, and he told me the exact same thing. So at around 15 or 16, I thought that I was possessed by the devil, that my parents were going to hell by putting me on depression medication, and that I was going to go to hell because depression was a choice, and I couldn't figure out how to stop it. I started having a lot more negative views of myself, more so than I had with depression. Wow, pay attention to that. My self-esteem dropped big time with that. I really thought I was literally evil. I thought I was psychotic. I thought I was so sick that I didn't know what I was thinking because I couldn't figure out how I was letting the devil into my life and how I was choosing depression. It wasn't like I decided that I wanted to be depressed. This is obviously an extreme example, but there is often a thick stream of distrusting mental health professionals, of distrusting mental health medication and other treatments in many Christian communities. And so there are shades. It's not always abuse. Sometimes it's harm. Sometimes it's implicitly, I didn't really trust therapists and it took me another 10 years to finally go to one, right? That's not killing anybody necessarily, but might have been better to go 10 years earlier if that's what you really needed. The fifth and final of the external factors that my research uncovered is what I call protecting the system. There is, I was previously calling it abusers over abused. It's somewhere in between those two things, but it's basically the maintenance of whatever the power structure is that's in place. So for instance, being pressured to forgive an abuser while abuse is ongoing, leadership protecting or elevating abusers, church communities abandoning victims in difficult times, victim blaming, and gaslighting. Gaslighting is a term that is starting to lose its meaning in some corners of our society. It's become very, very common. But the official definition of gaslighting is to talk to someone in such a way that you are trying to make them feel like they are crazy for having the questions that they have. And then they start to believe, oh, maybe I don't have a real question. Maybe I'm just crazy. all of these types of things, they seek to basically protect the system. The system's there, it's working. You say this person abused you, well, we're going to defer to the system in any way we can. And maybe if there are 10 of you who say that, we might finally investigate this person or whatever. And that's an extreme version, but again, it's always on a continuum. It can be more subtle. Couple quotes. These are particularly victim blaming examples. I was told, well, if you had been a better wife, he wouldn't have been abusive. He wouldn't have had to be. A separate participant in the same study, they told me that I wasn't being submissive enough. If I had been more submissive, he wouldn't be abusive. So you can see here, these women come forward and they say, there's something broken in what we're doing here. My husband is abusing me in our marriage. And we're at a church. I'm coming here. This is the safe place to say it. And the pastors basically say, well, he's the husband. We have this way of doing things. It's probably on you, rather than prioritizing the victim and starting there. Now, I will say, if I could redo my research, I believe there is a sixth category of external potential abuse, and that is around purity culture and gendered sexuality. I don't have a lot of data on this. It's something that I want to look into in the future. But there is both sort of obvious stuff, like there are people in very restrictive environments who are strongly encouraged into, almost arranged marriages at a very young age, following the strict rules of the community. But there are other things like assumptions that evangelical sexual teaching often makes, that like men are essentially sex machines and they basically have no control over their urges. And so the only thing to do is basically put a pen around them, and women's responsibility is to situate the communal life for their husband such that their husband, who really can't help himself, will not go astray. These kind of assumptions can be tremendously damaging to both men and women. Okay, do we need like a 30-second breath? I mean, I told you, I warned you it would be heavy. When I do this as a double presentation, like a 2-week thing, I get into like healing from trauma and, all these, healthy cultures. We are going to get a little bit into healthy spiritual and religious cultures at the end of this talk. But you should forgive yourself if you feel like it's a little bit overwhelming. Let's move on to internal states. So as I said, there are external events that can happen to us, teachings, experiences. Then we have internal reactions as a consequence of those events. There are two main categories here from my research. The first is internal distress. So these are feelings of isolation, lack of self-worth, mourning the loss of my religious community, feeling a lack of spiritual direction, feeling self-hatred or self-loathing. And for anxious people, trying to avoid anxiety by avoiding religious settings altogether. I'm doing two quotes for this because internal distress is in some ways most of the ball game around religious trauma. These are the effects of trauma. These are the effects of abuse that manifest in our minds and bodies. And of course, our brain is a part of our body. As far as spirituality goes, for the next few years, I was deeply depressed and very angry with God, and I would cry myself to sleep every night, just telling him how angry I was with him. At that point, I wanted to stop going to the church, but then they were really my entire support system because I'd been going there for so long. All of my friendships were there, and all of the support that I would need was in that church. So I kind of felt stuck as well. I think this is a good time to call back to that thing I said much earlier, that religion and spirituality are a primary means for not only social support, but healing from abuse. And this person's story right here is so heartbreaking. Happens to be a woman. She had been at this church for so long that that is where her friends were, but that's where she was abused. So how can she access the very people? You know, I saw that you guys are providing support and meals and asking your friend how she's going recovering from an illness. What if you couldn't come back here? Because these were the people that had hurt you. That's what we're dealing with. That's the enormity of what we're dealing with. The other of the internal states is what I call a harmful God image. So this happens when basically God becomes the villain of the story, feeling betrayed by God, feeling directly harmed by God, and distrusting God. Here's a quote from a survivor. I also feel that if God exists, he is a big jackass. Apologies for the language. I did everything right. I followed all the rules. I think I strongly feel that about God. He betrayed me. I thought he was going to come through. Now, to be clear, this quote is not coming from an individual who is just, I don't know, has some weird thoughts about God or some strong thoughts about suffering or whatever. This is a person who experienced spiritual abuse, and this is the effect of that abuse. So, okay, that's the end of the really heavy stuff. We're going to transition to what is the opposite of spiritual abuse? What is a healthy religious community? Now, I don't have a ton of time because, again, I want to leave time for questions and answers and or group processing. But my favorite religion researcher, or religious abuse researcher, Dr. Lisa Oakley, she's in the UK. Here are 6 principles from her research on healthy communities. These are the type of communities that are naturally, they have natural antibodies, to use the language of our current day, against spiritual abuse. The first is that people are respected, valued, and nurtured, and they know it. And this includes leaders. So we all know the type of religious person who says, you're not going to want to hear this, but the most loving thing I can do is tell you the truth. After which they tell you usually something void of compassion and legalistic. Well, that doesn't count here. You can ask yourself, does the person I just talked to know from that conversation that I respect and value them? Do they know it? And if they don't know it, then it does not qualify. Another principle she found, and this is not a prescription, but it's true, that non-pastors can have as much or more power as staff members in church communities. It is this stuff does not only apply to proper leaders, but can apply to anybody who has social capital, any other kind of power within their group. The third is that questions and disagreement must be allowed. And one of the interesting things about that is that it's directly related to disclosure of abuse. If you have a culture where no one's really allowed to disagree with the lead pastor, and then the lead pastor abuses someone, how much more of a bar is it going to be that you have to clear for someone to take that disclosure seriously? 3 more takeaways from Dr. Oakley. She recommends leaving some interpretation up to individuals. Again, this is in the eye of the beholder, but the more rigid and, self-contained and unquestioned our system of belief is, the more danger we have for bad actors to use that system as a cover for being abusive, whether they mean to or even know they are being abusive or not. The second, the fifth rather, is forced accountability is dangerous. Safeguards are great. So when you are figuring out your policy of what happens when X happens, how do we respond? What's the process? Are people being forced to tell you things they might not want to tell you? Are you forcing people to relive traumatic experiences in the presence of 5 elders, you know, or are these policies in place to safeguard on behalf of potential victims? The final one is that the process is more important than the product. And Dr. Oakley makes a very simple and profound realization. She says, churches have to make big decisions every 10 years. Sometimes you're going to make the same decision again 10 years later that you made, and you got to think about it all over again. You might have to, the product is going to have to be reworked continually in any group of people that's dynamic and changing. The process, how you go about it, is what people will remember. Now, I want to say that Vox Community's second core value, that the church should be the safest place to talk about anything, come with all your doubts, questions, addictions, hangups, screw-ups, and brokenness, makes me feel so much warmth. I think that that value is a natural buffer and leads toward healing in both this questions and disagreements must be allowed, this third one, and leaving some interpretation up to individuals, the fourth one. So I want to give you guys some kudos on that. I love that principle. I think that that principle is consistent with the best research on healthy religious communities and that are resilient to spiritual abuse. So that concludes the slideshow and the official teaching. And we, I don't know, whoever is in charge here, I'll stop sharing my screen. I don't know if we were doing breakout groups or if we want to have group Q&A, but I'm down with whatever.
Sounds good. I'm going to call an audible in case your others can say, maybe we can take like a couple of questions from either the Zoom folks or the live here, and then we'll break out into some smaller breakout rooms to kind of process it together. How does that sound? Sound good?
It's great.
Are you up for that? Up for that, Dave?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Cool. So yeah, so feel free, unmute yourself if you're on the Zoom, or you can put something in the chat if you've got a question for Dan, or if somebody has one here, throw up your hand or stand up and yeah, what do you want to know more about? What needs some clarification? What do you got? Yeah, go. Yeah, we got one here. Yeah, you can just say it, I think. If not, I'll.
Hi, Dan. My name is Pete. Somewhere between an avid and a rabid permissionary. For those in the room, folks of us that have followed your podcast for a long time, coming to mind a podcast you did a long time ago on Jean Bonnet, the guy that founded Large Communities, and more recently your commentary on Mark Driscoll and the rise and fall of Mars Hill. Those of you that don't know those two names, they're both spiritual leaders, incredibly magnetic men who had huge downfalls, but for a long time led communities with seemingly incredible integrity. The one thing I'm kind of wondering about, I don't think that's a big problem currently in this community. I'm not currently part of Vox Communities, although I've followed by Erie and some of the founding this for a long time. How, in either your experience or in your research, do individuals that start to feel something in their body is not right, even if everybody else is kind of going along with, responding to the magnetism of that particular leader, how does that process begin in a community that all kind of seems like they're going one direction under the leadership of a really magnetic person? How do the very beginnings of that process begin? And speak to that any way that you want to. And finally, just thank you for your work. You've made a huge difference in my life.
Thanks, Pete. So you're saying like, how does it start to get bad? Like, what are the early stages like? Is that what you're getting at?
More, how does it start to get good? Like, if so when we walked into Mars Hill the very first time, my wife stopped at the door and she said, there is something wrong with this guy. I didn't see it. And I was drawn in. And it's not the first time in my life that I've come under kind of the influence, despite thinking I'm a reasonably critical thinker. I didn't have that sense, and my wife did, but she was one person and she just walked out and the machine kind of continued to spin on it as it did. So my question is, how do the first breaks happen for somebody that's starting to sense or feel inside of themselves something's not right here? So you can speak to that any way that you want to from the research perspective or your personal opinion or anything else. I'm just curious, how do poisoned or communities that have come under the influence of a really strong magnetic leader, how do they start to become healthy again? And what does an individual or a small group start to do?
Yeah, okay. I'll say two quick things that are separate from each other. The first is that there is so much natural human gravity toward charismatic leaders. We just, you know, it's an understatement to say history is replete with examples. It's like most of the history that we learn just like is those examples. Like that is history, you know. It's so big. So at some level, people who are good at that kind of manipulation will always be somewhat successful. They will always find some people who are willing to give up their own autonomy because they believe in this leader, and this leader has convinced them that they're a part of something big. So a church like Mars Hill, I don't know how familiar you all are with that story, but once it got to a point where, you know, I don't know what year it was, but like it was just going to end that way. That Driscoll was so power hungry and that he was so successful at getting some number of people on his side that he was always going to be able to have enough power to run the whole show. And he was always going to eventually fail at that because of his own failings, if that makes sense. Like, he was not motivated by the grace of God or God's love or the fruit of the Spirit. He was motivated by his narcissism. And eventually, if a narcissist gets the reins, now maybe they could keep a Fortune 500 company going indefinitely, but they're not going to be able to keep a church going indefinitely because it just doesn't work. Like eventually people will go, this needs to be a place where Jesus is, and Jesus is not here. So it was all kind of built in from the beginning. The second thing I'll say about your wife's reaction, and this is coming more from like my work with clients as a therapist, emotions give us really good information, and we are not always good at receiving or being being aware of that information. Sometimes women are better at this than men, but it's not a rule. But so your wife walked in that door and she got some information. Her body was like, whoa. And she took the extra step of going, okay, I should take that seriously, you know, and was kind of looking around. She's like, there's some bad juju in here. And, you know, maybe she also had known a few things and put some things together, right? Even if she hadn't remembered learning them, you know, what's going on unconsciously in our minds is very powerful. It's very, very powerful. And we neglect it at our own peril. Of course, there's discernment, and, you know, if you're having a panic attack and your thoughts are spinning out of control and your heart is racing and you feel like you're having a heart attack, that has some information for you, but you don't necessarily want to trust that information. You know, it's not just believe everything you feel, but especially in church communities that are highly intellectualized, like in Reformed theology, which at that time Driscoll happened to be into because it suited his own aims, there is a huge distrust of emotions. But emotions are incredibly important. They are our body's way of telling us that something's up before we have the language for it. And they're not infallible, but they're pretty good. So that kind of gets at your question. Hopefully that's helpful. There's a question in the chat from Barbara about my story. And I'll just answer with relation to spiritual abuse. So I am
Read the
studying
question
spiritual
for us.
abuse.
Those of us that are live, we can't see the question, so do you want to quick read it?
Oh yeah, the question is, what is Dan's story and why he got here? I don't know how much of why I got here I can answer. But the story around spiritual abuse is that when I was in 6th grade, I was at a conservative Christian elementary school, and one of the adults in this school gave me a book in around April of my 12th year of life that was called 1996, 96 Reasons Why Christ Will Return in September of 1996. This was April of 1996, and I was terrified. I had panic attacks nightly for a month or two until my 6th grade life had moved on to something else. But this Antichrist, end of the world, end times type predictions remained a reliable panic trigger for me through my early to mid 20s, and actually through 27. And so when I went to grad school for psychology and I needed to pick a dissertation topic, that's where my mind went. I initially was going to study that in particular, but realized that there's just not that much about spiritual abuse more broadly. And so I needed to kind of zoom out and look at it as a larger concept.
Good, thank you. All right, why don't we do this? Let's break into some smaller groups. We want to be respectful of everybody's time. So we'll take maybe like, I don't know, let's say 8 minutes or so not tons of time. Does that sound good? Okay. So let's take like 8 minutes. Those of you that are on the Vox, or I mean, in the Zoom Vox, we'll put you into some breakout rooms. And then those of us that are here, let's just turn our chairs around, maybe like groups of 3 or 4 or something like that. Now, do we have questions, or should I throw out a couple?
We don't. Dan, maybe one question we might be able to ponder.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I always love for people to, thinking back about your own story to the extent that you feel comfortable and safe doing so, what resonated with your own experience. You could also include those healthy aspects, and where do you see that health in either this community or other communities you've been a part of?
Perfect.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much. Yeah. So like Dan said, what resonated with you, and bad or good, and even think about, as a community too, what can we do to make sure that we're in a healthy place as well. So we'll take 7 or 8 minutes for that. Oh, you bet.
My wife
Not to, never wanted to. Yeah.
Oh,